stolen child grew into a gunslinger, until his mother returned from the gallows at 8 years old. Samuel watched his mother hang from the courthouse oak for a murder she didn't commit. 20 years later, when she walked back into his life very much alive, he realized everything he'd become was built on a lie that would destroy them both. The rope creaked in the October wind like a door that wouldn't stay shut. 8-year-old Samuel pressed his face against the jailhouse window, his breath fogging the glass as the crowd gathered beneath the courthouse oak. His mother sat in the cell behind him, humming the lullaby she'd sung every night since he could remember. The same lullaby that now sounded like a funeral hymn. "Don't look, Samuel," she whispered, her voice steady as stone. "Turn away from the window." But he couldn't turn away. Not from the men in black coats who tied the noose with practiced fingers. Not from the women in their Sunday dresses who brought their children to witness justice. Not from the way his mother's name was carved into the courthouse steps where 1,000 boots had worn the word shallow. Margaret Thorne, murderess. The sheriff came for her at noon, when the sun hung directly overhead and cast no shadows. Samuel watched them lead his mother across the dusty street, her chains singing a quiet song with every step. She walked with her chin high, like she was going to church instead of the gallows. That was when the stranger appeared. He stood at the edge of the crowd, tall and lean as a lightning rod. His black hat was pulled low over a face that looked like it had been carved from desert stone. One eye was gone, replaced by a patch that made him look like something from Samuel's nightmares. But it was his remaining eye that caught the boy's attention, gray as winter sky, fixed not on the gallows but on Samuel himself. The man pushed through the crowd with quiet purpose, his boots making no sound on the hard earth. When he reached the jailhouse window, he tapped once on the glass with a gloved knuckle. Samuel stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Boy," the stranger said, his voice carrying through the thin glass. "You Samuel Thorne?" Samuel nodded, unable to find his voice. "Your mama sent me. Said if anything happened to her, I was to look after you." But that couldn't be true. Samuel had never seen this man before in his life. His mother had never mentioned anyone with one eye and a voice like gravel. Outside, the crowd grew quiet. The preacher was reading from his Bible, the same verses they read at every hanging. Samuel pressed his face to the glass again and saw his mother standing on the platform, the noose around her neck like a collar made of hemp. She was looking directly at him through the window. Their eyes met across the distance, and she mouthed 3 words, "I love you." Then the trap door opened, and Margaret Thorne dropped into eternity. The crowd cheered like it was the 4th of July. Samuel's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the jailhouse floor, his world spinning like a broken compass. The stranger was inside now, somehow, kneeling beside him with hands that smelled of gunpowder and tobacco. "Name's Colt Brennan," the man said softly. "And your mama didn't kill nobody, boy. I know because I was there that night." Samuel looked up through tears that made everything blur. "Then why didn't you tell them? Why didn't you save her?" Brennan's one eye hardened like flint. "Because some truths are more dangerous than lies. And because your mama made me promise to keep you safe, even if it meant letting her swing." He lifted Samuel to his feet with surprising gentleness. Through the window, they could see men cutting down his mother's body, wrapping it in canvas like she was cargo bound for somewhere far away. "She's gone now," Brennan said. "But I aim to teach you something those men in their fancy coats don't understand." "What's that?" Brennan's hand moved to the gun on his hip, fingers touching the worn grip like a prayer. "That justice don't always come from a judge's bench. Sometimes it comes from the barrel of a gun, if you're fast enough and angry enough to pull the trigger." Samuel stared at the weapon, its metal gleaming in the afternoon light. He thought of his mother's face as she dropped through the trapdoor. He thought of the men who cheered her death. He thought of 20 years stretching ahead of him like an empty road. "Will you teach me?" he asked. Brennan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only the cold promise of vengeance deferred, but not forgotten. "Already am, boy. Already am." They left Redemption, Texas that same evening, riding west into a sunset that painted the sky the color of blood. Samuel never looked back, but he carried the sound of that creaking rope with him, a rhythm that would match his heartbeat for the next 20 years, until the day a telegram arrived with news that would shake his world like an earthquake. His mother's ghost was coming home. The telegram shook in his hands like a leaf in a storm, for words that shattered 20 years of grief. Your mother lives, Samuel. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning. Carried by a boy who couldn't have been older than Samuel was when the world first broke in half. Samuel sat outside the saloon in Bitter Creek, cleaning his Colt .45 with the same careful precision Brennan had taught him 20 years ago. The metal gleamed like a promise in the desert sun, each chamber loaded with the kind of justice that came quick and final. 3 notches carved into the grip told the story of men who'd drawn too slow or aimed too poor. The messenger boy approached with nervous steps, his eyes fixed on the gun in Samuel's hands. "You Samuel Thorne?" the boy asked, voice cracking like dry wood. Samuel nodded without looking up from his weapon. Few people used his real name anymore. In the territories, he was known simply as the preacher's son, a cruel joke that followed him from town to town like a shadow that wouldn't stay put. The boy held out a yellow piece of paper, folded and sealed with red wax. "Telegram from Santa Fe. Man, paid me double to make sure it reached you personal." Samuel took the message, noting how the boy backed away quickly, as if death itself might be catching. He cracked the seal with his thumbnail and unfolded the paper. The words hit him like a kick from an unbroken horse. "Your mother lives. Mission San Miguel, Santa Fe. Come alone." Father Rodriguez, the telegram fell from his fingers, carried away by a wind that tasted of dust and impossible things. Samuel's hands began to shake, the same hands that had never trembled while drawing his gun, not even when facing down 3 men at once in Tombstone. His mother was dead. He'd watched her swing from the courthouse oak. He'd heard the snap of her neck, seen them wrap her body in canvas and bury her in the pauper's field outside Redemption. He'd carve her name into a wooden cross with his own knife. Margaret Thorne was 20 years in the ground. But the telegram said otherwise. Samuel rode hard for 3 days, changing horses twice and sleeping under stars that looked different somehow, as if the very sky had shifted while he wasn't paying attention. The mission sat at the edge of Santa Fe like a bone-white fortress against the red mountains, its bell tower reaching toward heaven with desperate fingers. He found her in the garden, tending to tomatoes that grew in neat rows despite the unforgiving soil. She wore the simple brown robes of a nun, her hair covered by a white veil that made her look like something from a stained glass window. But her hands, Samuel knew those hands. They were the same hands that had braided his hair and mended his shirts and held him close during thunderstorms. She looked up as his shadow fell across the garden path. Their eyes met across 20 years of separation, and time folded in on itself like a letter being sealed. She had aged, her face lined with sorrows he couldn't name, but her eyes still held the same green fire he saw in his own mirror each morning. "Samuel," she whispered, his name falling from her lips like a prayer answered. He dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. Every step toward her felt like walking through deep water, each movement fighting against the weight of grief and disbelief. "You're dead," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "I watched you die." She stood, brushing dirt from her robes with hands that trembled just as much as his. "They cut me down in time. The rope." She touched her throat, where a thin white scar circled her neck like a collar made of moonlight. Father Martinez was in the crowd. He saw me breathing and claimed my body for Christian burial. Instead, he brought me here. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to his gun. 20 years of training made the motion automatic as breathing. But when he looked at this woman, this ghost made flesh, his fingers couldn't find the grip. "Why didn't you find me?" The question came out broken like glass hitting stone. "I was just a boy. I needed you." Margaret stepped forward, and Samuel stepped back. The distance between them felt wider than the desert that stretched beyond the mission walls. "I tried," she said. "I searched for 2 years before the church convinced me you were better off believing I was dead. They said you'd been taken in by a good family, given a new life far from the shame of having a murderer for a mother. Samuel's laugh came out bitter as alkali water. Good family. He pulled back his coat, revealing the gun that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. This is what became of your boy, Mother. This is what Colt Brennan made of me. The color drained from her face. Brennan? Colt Brennan took you. You know him. Margaret's legs gave out, and she sat heavily on the garden bench beside the tomato plants. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her mouth. He was there that night, she whispered. The night they said, I killed Jonas Fletcher. Brennan was the only witness, the only one who could have cleared my name. Samuel felt the world tilt sideways. He said he knew you were innocent. He said he lied. Margaret's voice carried 20 years of pain. He let me hang so he could take you. Mold you into something I never wanted you to become. The truth hit Samuel like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his hand finally finding his gun. But instead of drawing it, he pressed his palm against the grip as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. All those years, all those lessons in violence and vengeance, all those men he'd killed in the name of the justice that was never served. He'd been Brennan's weapon all along. Margaret stood slowly, her eyes filled with tears that caught the afternoon light like broken glass. She reached toward him, the same gesture she'd made when he was 8 and frightened by thunder. Samuel, she said softly, my son, come home. But Samuel was already backing toward his horse, his world crumbling like adobe walls in an earthquake. Some truths were too heavy to carry. Some reunions came 20 years too late. The woman who'd given him life stood in a garden where nothing should grow, while the son she'd raised reached for the gun that had become his only gospel. Between them lay 2 decades of silence that no amount of words could ever fill. Colt Brennan rode into the mission with fire in his eyes and 20 years of lies on his tongue, demanding Samuel choose between the woman who bore him and the devil who made him. The sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air like a blade through silk. Samuel stood in the mission chapel, staring at a wooden cross that seemed to mock him with its promise of redemption. Candles flickered in the desert wind that slipped through gaps in the adobe walls, casting dancing shadows that looked like ghosts reaching for something they'd never touch. His mother knelt in the front pew, her lips moving in silent prayer. She'd been there for an hour, her rosary beads clicking softly like raindrops on a roof. Every few minutes, she would look up at him with eyes that held more hope than any one person should carry. He's coming, Samuel said, not turning from the cross. Margaret's prayers stopped. How do you know? Because I know Colt Brennan. Samuel's hand rested on his gun, fingers tracing the worn grip. He doesn't let his investments walk away. The chapel door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters across the stone floor. Brennan strode in like judgment itself, his one good eye scanning the room with predatory focus. Behind him came 3 men Samuel recognized, Jake Morrison, Tom Silva, and Billy Crane. 20 years of riding together had made them extensions of Brennan's will. Well, Brennan drawled, his voice carrying the same cold amusement Samuel remembered from childhood. The prodigal son returns to mama's skirts. Samuel turned slowly, his movements deliberate as a snake coiling to strike. Hello, Colt. Brennan's gaze shifted to Margaret, who had risen from her knees but kept her hands folded in prayer. His scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile if it had held any warmth. Sister Margaret, he said with mock politeness, or should I call you by your real name? The murderess of Jonas Fletcher? I never killed anybody, Margaret said quietly. And you know it. Brennan laughed, the sound echoing off the chapel walls like a curse. Of course I know it. I'm the one who put the knife in Fletcher's back. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest. Not surprise, but the final confirmation of a truth he'd been running from for 3 days. Why? Samuel asked. Fletcher was just a store clerk. What did he ever do to you? Fletcher was fixing to marry your mama, Brennan said, circling them like a wolf around a campfire. Going to take her west to California, start a new life. Take you with them. Margaret's face went white. You killed him because I needed the boy. Brennan cut her off. I've been watching Samuel for months. Saw how quick he was with his hands, how steady his nerves stayed when other children would panic. I knew what he could become with proper teaching. Samuel's world tilted further off its axis. You killed a man to steal me? I liberated you from a life of mediocrity, Brennan snarled. Made you into the finest gunfighter this side of the Mississippi. You should be thanking me. The rage that had been building in Samuel's chest for 3 days finally erupted. His gun cleared leather faster than thought, the barrel aimed at Brennan's heart. Around the chapel, Brennan's men drew their own weapons, but Samuel didn't care. 20 years of training made him faster than all of them. I should kill you right now, Samuel said, his voice steady as bedrock. Brennan didn't flinch. But you won't. Give me one reason why not. Because you're my son now, Brennan said simply. Blood don't make a man. Teaching does. Raising does. I made you everything you are, Samuel. Every skill, every instinct, every victory you've ever claimed, all of it came from me. Margaret stepped between them, her small frame dwarfed by the violence crackling in the air. Samuel, no. This isn't who you are, isn't it? Brennan's voice dropped to a whisper. Look at him, Margaret. Look at what your boy became. He's got 23 kills to his name. 23 men who drew too slow or aimed too poor. You think your prayers can wash that much blood away? Samuel's gun hand began to shake. Not from fear or doubt, but from the weight of 23 graves he'd dug with his own choices. Every face flashed through his memory, some deserving, some just desperate, all of them dead because he'd been faster. I never wanted this for you, Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. I wanted you to be a teacher, maybe a doctor, someone who helped people instead of what? Samuel's voice cracked like a whip. Instead of the killer you raised me to be? Because that's what I am, Mother. That's all I've ever been good at. That's not true, she said, reaching toward him again. It's not too late to choose a different path. Brennan spat into the dust at his feet. Pretty words, but they don't change facts. You can dress him in preacher's robes, but underneath he's still my boy. Still the fastest gun in the territories. Still the man who's kept me alive for 20 years. Samuel looked at his mother. Really looked at her for the first time since their reunion. She stood in the candlelight like a saint in a painting, her face peaceful despite the guns pointed in her direction. No fear, no anger, just an endless well of love that he'd never learned how to accept. Then he looked at Brennan, the man who'd shaped him into a weapon and called it fatherhood. You're right, Samuel said finally. I am your boy, Colt. You made me into exactly what you wanted. Triumph flashed in Brennan's good eye. But she made me first, Samuel continued, and his gun swung toward Brennan's men. And maybe it's time I remembered what that felt like. The chapel exploded into violence as 4 guns spoke at once, muzzle flashes lighting the holy space like lightning strikes. But in that moment before the thunder, Samuel caught his mother's eye and saw something he'd forgotten existed. Pride mixed with heartbreak, love stronger than 20 years of separation. For the first time in 2 decades, Margaret Thorne's son was coming home. When the gun smoke cleared and the chapel fell silent, it wasn't bullets that decided Samuel's fate. It was a choice made in love instead of hatred, changing everything forever. The gunfire lasted only seconds, but it echoed through eternity. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Brennan's men lay sprawled across the chapel floor, their blood mixing with 20 years of dust and forgotten prayers. Billy Crane clutched his shoulder, alive but finished. Jake Morrison and Tom Silva would never see another sunrise. Samuel stood over them, his Colt still smoking in his hand. 24 notches now, if he chose to carve them. But the wood grip suddenly felt foreign in his palm, like holding a snake that had finally shown its fangs. Colt Brennan sat propped against the altar, his shirt dark with blood from Samuel's bullet. But his one good eye still burned with the same cold fire that had shaped a frightened boy into a killer. Not bad, Brennan wheezed, pressing his hand against the wound. though you always did shoot a little high when you got emotional. Samuel's mother knelt beside one of the fallen men, checking for signs of life that weren't there. Her nun's robes were stained with blood that wasn't her own, but her hands remained gentle as she closed the dead man's eyes. Even now, Brennan said, watching her, even after everything, she still tends to the dying. Some habits never break. Samuel holstered his gun with movements that felt like lifting mountains. It's over, Colt. Is it? Brennan coughed, specks of red dotting his lips. You think killing me changes what you are? You think it washes away 23 graves worth of sin? Margaret looked up from her ministrations, her green eyes reflecting the candlelight like still water. Killing him won't bring you peace, Samuel. I learned that the night I should have died. Samuel stared at the man who'd raised him in violence and called it love. Then what will? Forgiveness, she said simply. The kind that starts with forgiving yourself. Brennan laughed, the sound wet and broken. Listen to her, boy. Same pretty words she used to sing you to sleep. But words don't stop bullets, and prayers don't resurrect the dead. Samuel walked to where Brennan sat bleeding against the altar. The man looked smaller somehow, diminished by his own mortality. For 20 years, he'd seemed larger than life, a force of nature that couldn't be contained or conquered. Now he was just a dying outlaw in a house of God. You're right, Samuel said. I can't undo what I've done. Can't bring back the men I killed or the years I lost. He knelt beside Brennan, meeting his one-eyed stare. But I can stop adding to the count. Brennan's face twisted with confusion and rage. You're going to let me live? After everything I took from you? I'm going to let you die, Samuel said quietly. But I'm not going to be the one who kills you. That bullet in your chest will do the job just fine. Coward, Brennan spat. You were always too soft. Even as a boy, you had too much of her in you. Samuel smiled, and for the first time in 20 years, it felt genuine. Thank you. The confusion in Brennan's eye deepened, but Samuel was already standing, already walking away from the man who defined his existence for 2 decades. He moved to the altar where a simple wooden cross hung above a table covered in white cloth. Without ceremony, he unbuckled his gun belt and laid it on the altar like an offering. The leather made a soft sound against the wood, final as a coffin closing. What are you doing? Margaret asked, rising from her vigil over the dead. Why should have done 20 years ago, Samuel said. He picked up the cross from the altar, feeling its weight in his hands. Plain wood, rough-hewn, honest in its simplicity. I'm choosing who I want to be. Behind them, Colt Brennan made a sound that might have been laughter or a death rattle. You think it's that easy? You think you could just walk away from what you are? Samuel didn't turn around. I think I can try. The chapel fell quiet except for the sound of wind through broken doors and Brennan's labored breathing. Margaret approached slowly, her footsteps whisper soft on the stone floor. The garden needs tending, she said. Would you help me? Samuel looked at his hands, the same hands that had drawn death faster than most men could blink. Calloused from gripping gunmetal, scarred from 20 years of violence. But they were still the hands his mother had held when he was 8 years old and afraid of thunder. I don't know how, he admitted. Margaret smiled, and in that expression, Samuel saw the woman who'd hummed lullabies in a jail cell while a noose waited outside. I'll teach you. We have time. They walked out of the chapel together, leaving Colt Brennan to make his peace with whatever God would listen to a dying outlaw's confession. The desert air was cool against their faces, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. In the mission garden, the tomato plants Margaret had been tending still grew in their careful rows. She knelt beside them, her hands finding the earth with the same certainty Samuel's had once found his gun. Here, she said, showing him how to work the soil around the plants. Gentle but firm. The roots need room to breathe. Samuel knelt beside her, his fingers clumsy in the dirt. But as they worked in comfortable silence, something loosened in his chest, a knot that had been tightening for 20 years finally beginning to unravel. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the chapel, Colt Brennan drew his last breath. But in the garden where nothing should have grown, A mother and son planted seeds in soil that had tasted too much blood. The desert wind carried away the sound of his dying, leaving only the whisper of leaves and the promise of tomorrow's rain.